I am honored and pleased to be the guest of the Lithuanian University for Educational Studies, and I would like to thank my hosts, and in particular Dainius Vytautas, for their hospitality. A few years ago, a colleague asked me to write a piece on the situation of naratology. I entitled the piece 1001 Questions on Narrative. And I produced a very detailed list of questions. I was, above all, proud of the question mark in the title. 1001 questions about narrative? Because some of the questions I asked were not real questions, they were rhetorical questions. And I was also proud of the question mark after my name, Geraldas Prince'as, because much of what I said had been said by other people, so it wasn't only me. My colleague found that my favorite questions were a little bit too cute. So he asked me to eliminate the question marks after the title and after my name. I did. He also said 1001 questions, too many questions. I reduced it to 100. He said, too many questions. I reduced it to 41 questions. And he published it. Today, I'm going to talk about some of these questions that I refer to in my title, Narrativehood, Narrativeness, Narrativity, and Narratability. So you'll have 4 questions. Narratology studies certain objects called narratives, what they have in common, as well as how they may differ one from the other. And there have been many more or less restrictive definitions of these objects, and various answers to the question, what is a narrative? Some theorists and researchers define narratives as verbal productions recounting one or more events, while others define them as any kind of representation of events, including non-verbal ones that rely on still or moving pictures, for instance, on gestures, or on a combination thereof. Some theorists say that narratives must involve causality, that they must be populated with individual beings and things, that they must be anchored in human experience, that they must constitute a whole. Others do not agree with most, some, or even any of these prescriptions. As for myself, I will adopt today the following definition in my discussion. An object is a narrative if it is taken to be the logically consistent representation of at least two asynchronous events that do not presuppose or imply one another, or a state and an event that do not presuppose or imply one another. This definition, which involves 6 conditions, and which is both flexible and limiting, has many virtues, apart from not conflicting with widely held views about the nature of narrative. That is, most people would agree more or less with the definition I gave. For instance, the definition distinguishes between narratives and non-narratives. Something like "it is nice outside" is not a narrative because it does not involve at least 2 events or one state and one event. It also distinguishes between narratives and so-called anti-narratives, texts that look like narratives but are not really narratives, like, for instance, the French new novels. They take the shape of a narrative, but they don't really tell any kind of a story that is coherent. I'm thinking, for instance, of the novel by Alain called La Jalousie, Jealousy. Moreover, however constraining my definition may be, it leaves many aspects of the objects it isolates indeterminate and leaves much room for diversity. It does not, for example, speak of the truth or falsehood of narratives, the factuality or fictionality of narratives, the ordinariness or artistry of narratives. Narratives can be true or false. They can be fictional or not. They can be very artistic or not at all. Nor does my definition specify the kind of topics the narratives address. They can be about many things, anything practically, and the kind of themes they develop. Nor does it limit their potential magnitude. They can be very long or very short, or restrict their modes and media of representation. They can be told in images or in words. Now, this definition and others too answer the question, what is a narrative? It indicates which objects constitute narratives. It specifies the class of objects designated by the term narrative. It characterizes narrative extension. This is an aspect of narrativity that I call narrativehood. Narrativehood is, if you will, the people made up of the individual narrative. But this definition also answers a slightly different question. Not what is a narrative, but what is narrative? A question pertaining to a quality rather than an object. A question focusing on an adjective rather than a noun. A question designating a set of intentionally with an S, not a T, an aspect of narrativity that I call narrativeness. What is a narrative? Narrative. What is narrative? What are the qualities for narrative? Narrativeness. Any object is qualifiable in many, many ways as many, many, many things. And an object is qualifiable as narrative if it exhibits some of the traits associated with narratives, and more specifically, if it is the logically consistent representation of two asynchronous events, etc., etc. Thus, narratologists have been significantly, though not exclusively, interested in what makes an object, and in particular, what makes a narrative narrative. As early as 1964, that is 50 years ago, Claude Prémont remarked, I quote, that what Vladimir Propp studies in the Russian tale is an autonomous layer of signification endowed with a structure which can be isolated from the whole message, narrative. In a little book called Le Récit, Narrative, Jean-Michel Adam underlines and develops this point. After putting aside the question of representational media, he identifies the narrative layer of signification as one of several different textual types: the descriptive type, the explicative type, the conversational type, etc. All these types are found in different texts, or sometimes in the same text. Indeed, most texts are a combination of several types, and one of the types is dominant. Similarly, in Coming to Terms, another important book in narratology, Seymour Chapman argues for thinking of texts in terms of text types, which he defines as, I quote, underlying or overriding structures that can be actualized by different surface forms. He focuses on three such structures: narrative, which he distinguishes from a narrative; description; argument. He notes that they can all occur in the same text, and he shows how each can operate at the service of others. For instance, narrative operates at the service of argument in La Fontaine's fable, The Crow and the Fox, Le Corbeau et le Renard, whereas the reverse is true in the Ithaca episode of James Joyce's Ulysses. There is indeed much more than narrative in narratives. There's comic effects, touching images, psychological insights, philosophical developments. And narratology aspires to account for the text type or structure, narrative, among other things, that is, for entities insofar as they are narratives, for narratives in their narrativeness. Given my definition of a narrative, for example, the presence or absence of events, the number of events, the temporal, causal, or implicational links between events would be narratologically pertinent, but comic effects, psychological insights, philosophical meditations would probably not be of narratological interest. Several points can be made on the basis of these various takes and remarks about narrativehood and narrativeness, about narratives, narrative, and narrativity. On the one hand, consider an object A satisfying 5 of the 6 conditions for narrativehood singled out in my definition. It is the logically consistent representation of 2 asynchronous events that presuppose or imply each other, and given that last specification, that object does not satisfy the 6th condition. That means that A, that object A, is not a narrative, and the same would go for an object B satisfying only 4 of the 6 conditions, or for objects C, D, E, and F satisfying none of them. However, it would not be unreasonable to maintain that A, with 5 of the 6 conditions, is probably closer to constituting a narrative than B, with 4 of the 6 conditions, and certainly closer to narrative than C, D, E, and F. That is, there are many objects that are almost narrative, but not quite. And there are some objects that are more narrative than others. But things are perhaps even more complicated. It is possible that the 6 conditions do not each have the same importance or the same weight. Event representation is central. Asynchronism may be more important than consistency. 2 event requirements may be more important than asynchronicity. So that it is conceivable that an object satisfying 3 conditions beyond the central ones is closer to constituting a narrative than another object satisfying a different set of 3 conditions. And it is even possible for an object satisfying 2 conditions to be closer to constituting a narrative than an object satisfying 3 conditions. On the other hand, if text types are more or less dominant in different texts, it is not only possible for the narrative type to be dominant in one text and ancillary in another, but it is also possible for the narrative type to be dominant or ancillary in 2 different texts, but more so in one or the other. Furthermore, it may occur that, because of its strong dominance in a given text, a quasi-narrative type, a structure realizable by text satisfying only 5 of my 6 definitional conditions, would give more narrative character or weight to that text, thus making it more narrative, as it were, than the fully narrative type would bestow on other texts because of its marked ancillariness in them. That is, some texts that are not quite narrative, according to my definition, seem more narrative than texts that are narrative, according to my definition. And this is why the subject of narrativeness is complicated. The possibilities I have mentioned point to the existence of degrees of narrativity. Some objects are narratives, some are quasi-narratives, and some are not narratives. Some narratives are more narrative than others, some non-narratives are more narrative than others, and some non-narratives are even more narrative than narrative. Now, though these various possibilities are a function of quantitative factors, 6 conditions, 5 conditions, 4 conditions, the different weight of the 6 conditions, there are other conditions that are more qualitative than quantitative. There are factors related to optional or definitionally implicit elements, as well as necessary and definitionally explicit ones. These qualitative factors more or less significantly foreground the narrative identity of a given text. They foreground the nature or the import of the narrative structure underlying the text. They foreground the structural constituents or the properties of that text, and they thus affect the degree of narrativity of the text beyond strict definitional considerations. These qualitative factors perhaps derive from the fact that certain textual components, without quite satisfying a definitional condition, tend more or less to do so. In other words, the narrativity of a text is not merely equivalent to its narrativehood and its narrativeness. It depends more generally on whatever makes a text more or less immediately identifiable as a narrative. I take a text sometimes very quickly because of some qualitative matters. I recognize it as a narrative. I take another text and its narrative qualities are more hidden, are less striking, are less immediately obvious. One textual qualitative factor would be the positiveness of the events depicted. Because narratives are representations of events and not of their mere possibility or of their negation. Narratives live in certainty. This happened, then that. This happened because of that. This happened and it was linked to that. Though narratives need not preclude hesitations or speculations or negations, in fact, these factors sometimes generate suspense or functions as signs of objectivity or emphasize the qualities of what actually happened. And though, at least in their verbal manifestations, narratives can be hospitable to interrogative, conjectural, and negative sentences, narratives can die under the effect of sustained indecision and ignorance. Another factor has to do with the discreteness of the events, since the more such discreteness of things, the more asynchronism is emphasized. Consider, for example, she ate and then she went to bed, as opposed to she went to bed after eating, or she had $1 million and then she lost it, as opposed to she lost the $1 million she had. All of them feature two events, but only two of them give equal weight to two events and therefore stress the asynchronicity of two events. She ate, then she went to bed. The two events are clear. She went to bed after eating. One event is hidden a little bit. Furthermore, as indicated above, a definitional element may not be present in a given text, but something more or less similar to it may be. Thus, even a textual segment like "it rains and hails and snows," or like "it rains and rains and rains," does not quite function as a representation of asynchronous events, but perhaps it's not far from doing so. How much of a difference is there between "it rains, then hails, then snows," and "it rains and hails and snows"? How much difference is there? It rains a bit at 6 o'clock, and then again at 7 o'clock, and it rains and rains and rains. Of course, these qualitative factors, like the quantitative ones, may not be equally important. And of course, their effect may vary from one textual economy to another. Just as various textual factors make some objects closer to narratives than others, or more or less prototypic narrative, or more narrative-like than others, various contextual factors make some objects more readily viewable or processable as narratives. Consider, for instance, a text like "she was very rich, and then she developed a passion for poker, and then she lost all her money," and consider it as a response to "tell me a story about her," or as a response to "give me an example of an English sentence made up of 3 conjoined sentences. Context also influences the effectiveness qua narratives of various objects, their narrative value, as distinct from their narrative identity and character, as distinct from their narrativity. Context influences what is characterized as the reportability or tellability or narratability, as I call it. And context, along with text, helps to answer questions like: what makes a narrative worth producing? What makes an object a successful, appealing, valuable narrative? In his classic discussion of the point of a given narrative, the reason for which that narrative is produced and the essential matter it is getting at, my colleague William Above emphasizes that, I quote, "pointless stories are met in English with the withering rejoinder, so what? Every good narrator is continually warding off this question. When his narrative is over, it should be unthinkable for a bystander to say, so what? Instead, the appropriate remark would be, he did, or similar means of registering the reportable character of the events of the narrative. Now, it is often the case that, to some extent at least, the raison d'etre, the reason for being of a narrative and its import, its significance, its worth, are indicated or suggested by so-called evaluative devices. For instance, the reflections of one character or another may underscore the unusual quality of the situations represented. This was really something incredible. The repetition of certain events may foreground their value. The use of disnarrated elements, explicitly referring to what did not take place but could have, may emphasize the quality of what did take place. And commentary by a narrator may directly state the point of the narrative. Furthermore, it may be that certain topics and themes are inherently interesting, and that their mere narrative deployment makes a narrative worthwhile. A sexist French recipe for successful narratives valorizes ingredients like mystery, religion, sex, and aristocracy. I quote, "My God," said the Duchess, "I'm pregnant. Who done it?" And an old American Reader's Digest formula is supposed to stress, along with sex and religion, personal experience, travel, money, and the animal kingdom. How I made love to a rich bear in the Alps and found God. Moreover, perhaps the very fact that any narrative brings together distinct events and links them temporally in a non-contradictory manner always sheds some light on the configurations or operations of time, thereby making a point. Yet, as Leboeuf's remarks more than suggest, there are perfectly well-formed narratives satisfying every condition for narrativehood, which depict and account for changes in situations and totalize them into sequences of interrelated parts, but are greeted with "so what" rather than "he did." Moreover, important topics and themes like sex and mystery are neither specific to nor characteristic of narratives as opposed to non-narratives, and they do not always play equally well in Vilnius, say, or in Philadelphia, where I come from. Conversely, perhaps any topic or theme, however local or insignificant, not only constitutes potential material for a narrative, not only is narrativizable, but also can be made narratively appealing, can be narratable. Perhaps any set of events, however unimportant or trivial, not only is susceptible of narrativization, but can also be endowed with narratability. In any case, that is what much fiction endeavors to show, that what seems to be trivial is not so trivial. And I, for one, find interesting any narrative that pertains to me. As for evaluative devices, they may not always prove quite appropriate or persuasive. After all, claiming that events are unusual, extraordinary, bizarre, unfortunately does not suffice to make them so. In short, even if narratability often depends on strictly textual factors, e.g. the nature of the events narrated, their configurations, or the nature of the focalization selected, the speeds exploited, the orders of presentation adopted. It also always depends on contextual works. I'm going to skip, for the interest of our question and answer session, I'm going to skip various other aspects, specific aspects of context that affects narratability, but you can imagine, or we can talk about them together. I skip then many things about context which we can imagine together, how different aspects of context affects our response to narrative. Still, even as I skip it, I hope that my brief discussion not only addresses basic questions regarding the character, form, and functioning of narratives. I hope that it also generates other narratological questions worth exploring on the nature, weight, and interaction of the factors affecting narrativity, for example, on the relation between particular representational media and narrativity or narratability, on the acquisition of the capacity to manipulate narrativity, on the different kinds of factors relevant to narratability that different groups or different genres exploit, and so on and so forth. Indeed, the systematic study of what in an object and its setting, what in a text and its context, encourages its identification as narrative or as a narrative, triggers the calling up of certain grids for processing it as such, and affect the value of such an invocation. All these things can clarify the character and specificity of narrative symbiosis, the meaning and meaningfulness of narratives and narrative moments.
Aš gal trumpą klausimą galima, kadangi čia vis tiek lietuviškų auditorijai turbūt gali būti gal svarbu. Vis dėlto, aš žinau, kad jūs rytoj kalbėsit, tai yra ketvirtadienį kalbėsit apie naratologijos tą raidą, bet galbūt gali būti įdomu, kokia Greimo naratyvinės semiotikos vieta ir kaip tai atrodo dabar iš tokios tam tikros perspektyvos. Mes turbūt pajutom, kokia dabar subtili yra šiuolaikinė naratologija. Gali kalbėti apie pasakojimą, įdomumą, vertę, įvairius dalykus. Tai norėčiau paklausti, kaip jis reagentas vertintų Greimo indėlį tyrant pasakojimus. Ir iš dabarties pozicijų. Ar kiek aktualu tas palikimas kažkoks?
The question is, what's the impact of Greimo's initiatives? Looking at it from today's perspective.
It's difficult for me to answer this question because though Greimas was a very important narratologist and very important for narratology, in particular because of his actantial model and also for his model of the trajectory of narrative from beginning to end. Prince'as was so ambitious that everything to him became narrative, so that there was nothing that was not narrative. So you could say anything about anything, and it was narrative. Except for what he did not address, really, is not so much what are the definitional factors of narrative, but what he did not address are very simple questions, but very important ones nonetheless. Why is it that we find some texts more narrative than others? Why is it that some great texts are narrative, but they're not very good narratives? In the same way as I always say, Mozart is great, but not for dancing. In the same way, some novels are great novels, but not for their story, not for their narrativeness, not for their narrativity. This, I think, Prince'as did not address, and in effect, few narratologists for the longest time did not bother with, did not ask them, not so much what is a narrative, but what makes a narrative narrative? What makes a narrative more narrative than others? Why do you and me not always agree on what is more narrative than what? And so on and so forth. So, again, Prince'as was very important, I think, for his attention model and for his description of the trajectory of the itinerary from beginning to end of narrative, but less so really for questions of narrativeness, narrativehood, narratability, and so on and so forth.
Aš su pertraukomis kalbėsiu, kuris bus lengviau versti. Norėjau padėkoti už paskaitą, bet kadangi čia mes esame Greimo žemėje, tai reikia apginti Greimą. Jūs išversite. Nes paskui dar neišversite šito.
Thank you very much for the lecture, but since we're on the theme of Greimos, I feel like we have to defend Greimos.
Pirmiausia, Greimas buvo jį domino ne pasakojimas, o reikšmė. Ir todėl, jeigu galima būtų sakyti, kad jis visur matė pasakojimus, tai netiesa. Jis visur matė arba daug matė naratyvumą. Nes jisai didesnę reikšmę skyrė naratyvumui, o ne pasakojimui.
First of all, I do not agree with you saying that Prince'as didn't pay attention to the narrativity. He did pay attention to the meaning, therefore, to narrativity. And he did see narrativity everywhere.
Ir kaip tik naratyvumą, jis matė, kad naratyvumą galima aptikti tiek naratyvuose, tiek nenaratyvuose, tiek naratyvinėse diskursuose, tiek tokiuose, kurie istorijų nepasakoja.
And he also noticed or indicated that you can find narrativity not only in narratives, you can find them somewhere else.
Tai čia mano diskusinė pastaba būtų.
This is my discussive remark.
O su visų kuo kitu aš sutinku. Yra su tuo, kad...
But I don't know everything else.
Yra su tuo, kad Greimas nesvarstė tokio klausimo, kodėl ir dėl kokių priežasčių vieni tekstai turi daugiau naratyvumo, kiti mažiau, o gal šito rasti, kad neturi nesiniai, arba kodėl vieni pasakojimai yra geresni už kitus, tai čia tiesa, iš tikrųjų to nesvarstė ir tai užtat tapo paskui Ženeto svarstama problema.
But I do agree with you that he did not really thought about why some stories are better than others, why narrativity exists in one story, but it does not in such amount in others.
Yes, since we are in the land of Preman, I agree with you.
Kadangi mes esame Krymo žemė, aš su jumis sutinku.
But really, the first two important texts of Premas, that is sémantique structurale, and then to some extent, but less so, in terms of influence, du sens, don't really tackle certain aspects of narrativeness and narratability. Also, I think it is true that Premas saw narrative aspects in non-narrative texts, but he saw narrative aspects everywhere. And therefore, what he saw, in my opinion, lost a little bit of its value because he saw it everywhere. It was everywhere, so it was, in a way, it wasn't distinctive enough. However, this is not to say, and I want to stress this, I criticize him as part of my Lithuanian family.
Galbūt tada knieti paklausim, nežinau, kaip vėlgi žiūrint iš šiuolaikinės naratologijos patirties, mane domina tas vertinimas pasakojimas. Kas tai yra įdomus pasakojimas? Nes čia buvo tas labai įdomus dalykas paminėtas. Pasakojimai įdomus, neįdomus, tokie dalykai. Kas tas įdomus pasakojimas? Vertingas. Kokie jo požymiai? Jūs kalbėjote apie pasakojimą, šešis požymius, apskritai, ne? Kokie įdomus pasakojimo požymiai galbūt?
I'm curious what are the features, the traits of an interesting narrative. What is an interesting narrative?
Very difficult question to answer because of context and because the indefinitely many features and aspects of context. So, for instance, there are narratives that when you read them for the first time are fabulous, but when you read them for the second time are boring. And sometimes you wonder, why did I like this narrative? What is valuable in this narrative? Maybe the only thing that is valuable in the narratives is the mystery and its solution. But if you know the mystery and you know the solution, there's nothing else left. Because there are so many features in the context that affect narrative, because there are so many features that lead us to say, so what, instead of, oh, really? Is that what happened? Because of that, it is very difficult to say what makes a narrative interesting. We have some notion. We know that there should surprise. We know that there should be suspense. But how much surprise? Where surprise? How much suspense? Where suspense? If I knew this, I'd be a great storyteller and a great millionaire. You know how many books there are that we call in English how-to books. How to write a good story. How to write a good novel. But you know how many people have written novels that are not good. And stories that are not good. You know that we all know, it's a human ability, like the language ability. We all know how to tell stories, but we don't all know how to tell good stories. We have an idea. We know that there should be curiosity on the part of our audience. We know that we should surprise them. We know that we should create mysteries and slowly show the solution to the mystery. We know that we should show how disparate events actually are related in strange and interesting ways. We know that, but beyond that, we don't. What I've said actually applies, in my opinion, just as well to journalism or to non-fictional narrative. Indeed, you know that you have now a very popular form, non-fictional literature, non-fictional novel. True novels, as it were. You know that in journalism you have, depending on the tradition of journalism, but in the United States you have the rule that you're supposed to answer very quickly 7 questions. Who, why, where, what, how, and so on and so on. You have to. But some people know how to ask them in a slightly different order, and they make for good reading, and other people simply know how to report the fact. You know that when you listen to commentators of a sports event on television or on the radio, some commentators who are like narrators, they tell you the story of the game. Some of them are excellent, and we like them. And some of them we find are no good. They say what everyone can see. We don't understand why they're there, etc., etc. A lot of things said about the narrativity or narratability of fiction can be said also about non-fiction, and And indeed, there is a form of journalism called the new journalism, with writers like Thomas Wolfe, for instance, or like Hunter Thompson. You read them, they're pieces of journalism about, I don't know, life in Las Vegas, or about this or that, about motorcycles, about, and they read like novels, they're great stories. And you have other pieces of journalism that may be very informative, that may be very interesting because of the information they provide, but that are not good stories, that do not make for good stories. So I think the same categories can apply in the realm of fiction and the realm of non-fiction, and narratology does not particularly care about that distinction, but it favors fiction for a number of reasons, one of them being that fiction is often very complex, very rich, and contains in itself a very great range of narrative tricks and categories. I want to add that in journalism in particular, you have a form that is very close to the old serial fictional form. You know what I mean, like Dickens or Balzac or Eugène Sue or other people would every week write for the newspaper a chapter of their novel. And people would wait for the next chapter, the next chapter, the next chapter. There's a famous story in France that Eugène Sue, a famous popular writer, was put in jail because of his political beliefs, and the Minister of the Interior took him out of jail because he wanted to read the next installment. Journalism is the same way. There is a form that's very, very popular. There is a murder, or a body is found in the forest somewhere near the town. What happened to the body? Who killed the body? Is it the cousin? Is it the nephew? Is it this one? Is it that one? Is it purely an accident? And it goes on sometimes for months, The one difference with journalism is we don't know the end. We don't know whether there will be an end. But it is very much like the feuilleton, like the soap opera, like the serial. Every day, every half day, every hour, we get a little more of the story. Who are the suspects? Who is the most important suspect? No, he could not be the most important suspect. It's someone else, and so on and so forth. This is a very narrative form and a very journalistic form. And some accounts in newspapers are better than others, usually in bad newspapers.
Suggest
this is a very interesting question. And number one, it's an interesting question because perhaps painting still images are not a particularly good medium for telling stories. Perhaps the still image, the medium of the still image, doesn't lend itself to narrative as well as either the moving image or words. And that's why narrative painting exists, but it is not the most important genre of painting. And we think much more of landscape painting, portrait painting, scenes of mythology or scenes of Madonna and child, rather than stories about the Madonna and the child, or stories about this and this and this and that. Number two, and this is also an interesting thing, is that there are conventions for narrative painting that some of us are well acquainted with, and some of us are not. And so that when we look at the painting, some of us recognize very quickly, it tells a story. Not a great story, but it tells a story. And look, this happens, and then that, and there are different foregrounds and backgrounds that show us different events happening. A little bit like in a comic strip, where we can follow a story even without words. But some of us do not know these conventions, and we look at the painting, we can like it, we can admire it in many ways, but we don't realize that it tells a story. This is why, when I gave my 6 conditions, I said an entity, an object, is a narrative if it is taken to be the representation of at least 2 events, etc., etc., etc. If it's taken to be. So, if I don't take something to be narrative, I don't take it to be. If I say, no, this is a narrative, it means that I see in it at least 2 different events, or 3 different events, and so on and so forth. So, to summarize, 1, I think still pictures are not a particularly powerful medium for storytelling. For instance, still pictures cannot say no. You cannot say John was not happy and then he became happy in a painting. You can show John sad, you can show John crying, but you cannot say John was not happy. You cannot say I in a painting. You can show a person and then you have to have a title saying self-portrait. Otherwise, all you see is a portrait of a man or of a woman, but it doesn't say I. there are many things, I mean, that different media can do and many things that they cannot do. Words can say I, words can say no, but words cannot show anything. They can evoke, they can suggest, they can make you think of, but they don't show you anything. And this is why, when, for instance, we make a movie from a novel, some people say, it's a good movie, but that's not how I saw the hero. That's not how I saw the heroine. This is why, when we make a movie out of a novel, sometimes we pick an actor with blue eyes and sometimes with brown eyes, and it really doesn't necessarily correspond to anything in the novel. So, different media have different powers and different limits. And also, we have different powers and different limits. One important thing about narrative is that narrative is not like a sign. A sign you recognize. If I see an A, I recognize it is an A. If I see a B, I recognize it is a B. If I know the alphabet, I have to know the alphabet. If I see a text, I do not recognize it as a narrative. I have to understand it as a narrative. I have to take it to be the representation of events. If I look at this, I don't know whether it's a narrative or not. I have to understand it. I do not recognize it. But if I see the end at the beginning here, I say, I recognize this sign. I don't have to understand it. And that's why, for instance, I can read Lithuanian, but I don't understand it.
Reikia turbūt baigti. Palikime kažką pasakoti ir vėliau. Labai norėčiau padėkoti mūsų katedros lietuvių literatūros katedros mokslininkai Geraldas Prince'as, kurie puikiai transliavo mums siunčiamą žinią apie naratologiją. Ačiū profesoriui ir manau, pataupykim dar parą kitiems susitikimams, nes to reikalauja turbūt ir padarumas. Norėjau kažkaip kitaip. Ačiū.